Well, welcome everyone, one and all of you joining us on Zoom from around Australia and from overseas, and all of you here present in person at the University of Melbourne, including Dr. Anne Rickards, members of the Rickards family and distinguished guests. At the outset, and on behalf of us all, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the place in which we are gathered, their elders, past and present, and thank them deeply for their grace in countenancing our presence here this evening. I thank their children and young people too for the inspiring example they provided to all of us of courage and creativity in the face of ongoing monumental challenge. My name is Alan Maudsley, and I greet you on behalf of MIFVIC in lieu of our president, Joe, who wasn't quite well enough to deal with all these formalities, but we'll talk to you later. MIFVIC hosts the Winston Rickards Memorial Oration, Winston being the inaugural president of our organisation, and information is available about his contributions at the front desk. The oration is supported by other groups with which Winston Rickards was closely linked. These are the Royal Children's Hospital Mental Health Service, the Mental Health Foundation Australia, the Faculty of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, Emerging Minds Australia, and the Royal Children's Hospital Centre for Community Child Health. We welcome all representatives and members of those organisations here tonight and thank them for their co-sponsorship. As I said, the oration is named for Winston Rickards, our founding president, whose interdisciplinary work in child and adolescent mental health was groundbreaking. Information is available from the outer desk. So we come to the oration. First, I will ask those present to turn off your mobile phones for the oration. At its conclusion, after 60 minutes or so, I will ask Associate Professor Campbell-Paul from our 12th orator to respond, and then welcome general discussion, including questions from our Zoom audience. Around 9:30, I'll ask our president to speak briefly about the work of MIFVIC and conclude the event. After a brief photo shoot, we'll enable our orators to be available to speak personally with you in the foyer a little bit after the event. My great pleasure to introduce not one but two orators. Ruth Wraith, OAM, is an eminent child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapist coming from an initial professional background of occupational therapy. A mainstay within Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital Child Psychotherapy Service, Ruth served as head of that department for 10 years, as well as working as a disaster and trauma clinician and consultant. She is a past president of the Child Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Association of Australia and of the Royal Children's Hospital Alumni Association, and founding chair and past president of the Australian Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Her co-presenter, Dr. Jennifer Ray, educational and developmental psychologist, is a linchpin of child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapy training in Australasia. Jenny worked for 20 years in the psychotherapy department at the Royal Children's Hospital Mental Health Service, with special interest in small children, and at the hospital's Gatehouse Centre with abused children and adolescents of all ages. Then completed doctoral research on mother-infant relationships in infants with severe congenital heart disease. In 2012, Jenny set up training in child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapy at the University of Auckland returning to Melbourne in 2013 to coordinate child psychotherapy studies in the Master of Mental Health Science program at Monash University. My great pleasure to call on Ruth to present the first part of the oration.
Thank you, Alan, for your introduction for Jenny and myself. And Jenny and I are especially honoured to have some of Dr. Rickards' family here with us tonight and others who are on Zoom. And we're also delighted to welcome you, our audience, both here in person and on Zoom, to this oration. We're all here this evening because we share a deep interest in children and young people, especially their psychological well-being and their mental health. In the big picture, spanning thousands of years, this interest and concern is very recent. Percy Fitzgerald, a literary associate of Charles Dickens, wrote, "It occurred to him, Dickens, what if he interpreted in his writings, the minds and feelings of dogs, horses, birds, and above all, children. No one had done that before." End of quote. This was the mid-19th century, roughly only 170 years ago. Around this time, Lewis Carroll, with Alice in Wonderland, engaged the imagination of children with his empathic style, and this engagement continues very powerfully today. Prior to the 17th century in much of Europe and the UK, children had been regarded as little adults, with the idea of childhood as a defined entity, beginning with John Locke. This was also the period when children from 7 or 8 years old worked in factories for long hours in appalling conditions and were seen as inferior and indeed were powerless. Sigmund Freud was the first person to articulate stages of psychosocial development of babies and children, and as such, this was the starting point for the exploration of the theories and practices that have evolved, of which child psychoanalytic psychotherapy is one. The application of this is what we are considering this evening. Okay, there we are. Changes underway in our society are many and profound. They're impacting on parent-child relationships and parenting styles. These include, but are not limited to, the workforce gig economy, financial pressures for families, the impact of the many facets of the digital world, including social media for both children and their parents, and the increasing engagement of women in the workforce, realigning family roles, expectations, and functioning. There are deep anxieties and adjustments around climate change, along with community-based interpersonal conflict, such as bullying, increased anger and aggression, plus the conflict-ridden international environment in which we live. Children and families, by and large, live in a hyper-stimulating world of media, of expectations, busyness, and planned or incidental distractions. As a result, children may, and often do, become lost in the hustle and the bustle of everyday life. Living with constant change, uncertainty, and maybe fear about the future, as well as doubt about what the future holds, are the reality for many children and youth, as well as for adults. Across all generations, these social shifts bring with them far-reaching impacts on how life is lived and experienced. The impact is evident in the increased concern for the mental health of our young and the increase in reported mental ill health requiring clinical care. The WHO World Mental Health Survey Initiative, published last year and led by Professor McGrath from the University of Queensland with Harvard University, estimated that 50% of all adult mental ill health has its onset before the age of 18. To many, it's apparent that an outcome of the current pressures and social changes result, in some instances, in basic psychological and developmental needs of many children and adolescents being distorted or unmet. Psychoanalytic theory, research and practice provides valuable insights to understand and help support healthy development of children and young people. The thoughts, ideas, feelings and understanding of themselves for children and their relationships and the world they live in all contribute to their mental health. This is a dynamic and ongoing process throughout infancy, childhood, adolescence, and indeed life. In every child, there is their own infant self. In every adolescent is their own infant and child. And in every parent has their infant, child, and adolescent self integral to who they are in the here and now. Psychoanalytic theory and practice provides an underappreciated understanding of infants, children, youth, and their families, and also more broadly of the communities and the organisations engaged with them, where their mental health and well-being needs are being addressed. This 13th Winston Rickards Memorial Oration will hopefully stimulate your thinking about challenges and directions for the future as the presentation proceeds. Dr. Rickards' contribution to child psychiatry commenced in the era when the mental health of infants and children was barely on the radar, and in fact, acknowledgement of mental ill health for infants and children was, by and large, resisted. It was a time when mental ill health was more commonly seen through a behavioural or moral lens. Dr. Rickards was appointed Director of Psychiatry at the Royal Children's Hospital in 1955. He supported the already established work of Ruth Drake and Margaret Erickson, then called play specialists, who were the pioneers from the 1930s and 40s, approaching 100 years ago, of what has evolved over the decades as the profession of child psychoanalytic psychotherapy in Australia. Prior to the development of formal training, which is now the Masters of Child Psychotherapy Studies at Monash, he included Arlene Anderson and myself in the child psychiatry component of the Diploma of Psychological Medicine training, as well as providing us with additional psychoanalytically-oriented child therapy supervision. As a founding member, Dr. Rickards served on the Executive Committee of the Professional Association, the Victorian Child Psychotherapy Association, now the Child Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Association of Australia. Within a multidisciplinary context, a foundation philosophy of the Department of Psychiatry was psychoanalytic in the broadest and most dynamic application, aiming to bring deep and informed understanding to the lives of children, their families, the context of their lives, and the services with which they are engaged. Underpinning his clinical work, teaching, consultation and guidance to many, many organisations and services was the understanding that every child, every parent, and every child-parent relationship was unique. Dr. Rickards was a visionary, a facilitator and defender of the psychoanalytic contribution to infant, child and youth mental health, and he created a culture where this could evolve and be provided by skilled clinicians. He had a natural and empathic affinity for the inner world of the child. He brought to the Royal Children's Hospital and Melbourne leading international thinkers and practitioners, all pioneers who were working to illuminate the inner world of children and who each had a profound influence in paediatrics, psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychology, and related allied health professions, to teachers and to society in general. Early in my career, I benefited from these. Dr. John Bowlby, whom many of you will know through attachment theory, Iska Wittenberg, a pioneer child psychotherapist, Mildred Creek, who developed an early understanding of autism, Berry Brazelton, who explored mirroring of infancy, and James Anthony developing an understanding of resilience and vulnerability in children. It is Dr. Rickards' legacy, contextualised to the 2020s, that Dr. Ray and I will briefly explore this evening. Dr. Ray carries his legacy forward in her role as child psychoanalytic psychotherapist and coordinator of the Master's Child Psychotherapy Studies at Monash, as outlined in the introduction by Alan. Dr. Ray will now outline some concepts in contemporary psychoanalytic theory and research. I'll then briefly address child psychoanalytic clinical practice, followed by 2 examples of psychoanalytic theory applied within the community context. In our discourse, we will frequently use the word child when it is appropriately inclusive of youth and infants as well. There are many challenges for child and youth mental health in the current climate, and we will briefly consider these and then have time for questions and discussion to close. Jenny, thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And, oh, that might be handy, yeah. I've been given the brief to talk about the concepts of psychoanalytic theory and research. It sounds awfully dry, doesn't it? So I'm going to do my best to, you know, weave it in. The other instruction I got was don't use any technical language. So I'm going to give it a best shot. So I hope I don't dumb it down in doing that. When I was a new psychologist, I remember feeling I knew nothing about working with children and families. The psychology course didn't equip me. Psychologists were trained in only one treatment mode, CBT. Now perhaps DBT and MBT, but back then, these treatments are not suitable for children younger than about 7 years, as they have not yet developed sufficient cognitive capacity. I was on the lookout for further clinical training. I felt I'd come home when in 1991, I discovered the Child Psychotherapy Training Program run by the Health Department, which became a Master's in Child Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy during my training in 1994. There are few specialist courses in any allied health professions dedicated entirely to working therapeutically with children and families. It is strange, really, that it's so rare when the building blocks of society, as Ruth was saying, are our children and families. And the Victorian Royal Commission into Mental Health showed us how desperately we need mental health clinicians. However, it is met with a major stumbling block in implementing. The planned one-stop hubs to service child and adolescent mental health services in a broad sense are foundering in the setup because they can't be staffed. There are burgeoning numbers looking for services, and there is a critical shortage of trained mental health clinicians to staff the hubs. Given the early years are so crucial to later development, as Ruth has pointed out, this is really concerning. Well, you know, what is child psychotherapy? Ruth again has sort of pointed out that child psychotherapists understand a child has a mental life and a subjective way of experiencing the world. And psychoanalytic psychotherapy, or the theory, provides a guiding and central framework. We work to reduce symptoms and also to relieve suffering by listening to the underlying themes and dynamics in the child and their family relationships. Research has shown that working at a deep level can facilitate sustained change. I've got references here, but they'll have to wait for discussion afterwards or the website. We also have specialist training to develop observation skills. Detailed observation facilitates understanding of what lies beneath the child's symptoms and presenting difficulties, and theory provides the coherent framework for making meaning. So let's unpack this a little bit. You know, who are our core theorists? So there are our core theorists, the ones that, you know, our basic ones. Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, Winnicott and Bion, all object relations. Well, not all, they're all developmentalists in a sense. And Klein, Winnicott and Bion would be regarded. Klein and Bion, object relations. Winnicott, Psychoanalyst John Bowlby was also critical at this earlier level. As you know, most of you know, he took a developmental lens and built his theory of attachment on early experience and the opportunities for a child to develop a capacity for lasting and meaningful relationships. These capacities are built around expectations of relationships and the templates developed, that is, internal working models. Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth collaborated in developing ways to operationalise and research attachment concepts. This led to an enormous body of research into attachment relationships. For example, the adult attachment interview, the working model of the child interview, the strange situation, Peter Fonagy's research. His research team at the Anna Freud Centre have identified reflective function and mentalisation as key variables to research and apply in clinical programs. I'll return to further child psychotherapy research a little later, but I want to show you the more contemporary sort of influences. So we now draw on a whole range of contemporary theorists and therapists. Some are theorists and some are therapists, but all have written extensively and influenced contemporary child psychotherapy practice. Dan Stern, Beatrice Beebe, Alessandra Lemma, Anne Alvarez, Graham Music, and Antonino Ferro, who's heading up this very new field theory approach to thinking about child psychotherapy. So the contemporary research influences come from attachment theory and research into intersubjectivity, relational theory, neurobiology, and research in infancy. The theoretical frame, so moving into the theoretical frame of child psychoanalytic psychotherapy, the practice relies particularly on the setting. And by this, I mean the child or young person is seen in the same room at the same time and day with the same therapist each week. This regularity provides a containing structure. This in itself is very important for those who have experienced disruption and chaos in their lives. The therapist's mind is a crucial part of this setting. And the therapist's mind I've listed on that slide there are drawn very much from psychoanalytic theory. The setting with doubt, and I can't read it from here. I've got to change my glasses to read that. Oh, my lordy. What sucks getting old. So, sitting with doubt and uncertainty, reverie, Bion, containment, again, Wilfred Bion, keeping thinking whilst under fire, Bion, surviving hateful attacks, or deadening, Winnicott, and Bion, I guess, reflective function, attachment theory, and Peter Fonagy's research, being in the here and now, the transference relationship. I want to take you on a journey through a therapy vignette to explain the theory or some of the theory that underpins a child psychotherapist's way of working. It is from child psychotherapist Margot Waddell's book, Inside Lives, because that was another instruction. We weren't to use our own clinical vignettes. Sammy was a 3-year-old referred for therapy when his parents became distraught at his intense and protracted nightmares. Sammy was a twin who had been born premature and sickly and stayed in hospital for 2 months longer than his twin sister, who went home with mother. His mother was very depressed following the twins' birth. She was convinced Sammy would die. 3-year-old Sammy was a happy boy during the day and terrified and tyrannical at night. Likewise, he found his mother responsive and loving during the day, but she turned frightening to him at night. Melanie Klein wrote about the child having an inner world or fantasy life from birth or even before birth. In very early infancy, every discomfort, she explained, is experienced as though a hostile agent has thrust something bad into the infant and they want to get rid of it. When the mother is responsive and soothing, she's felt to be a nurturing, good person. When absent, as for Sammy, there is no one to soothe him. Klein saw how an infant needed to keep good and bad separate in case they contaminate each other. This is a very early protective strategy for making sense out of chaos. I'm sure you've all felt the particular piercing quality and extreme discomfort of hearing an infant crying. It gets right under the skin. Now, this is what I mean when the infant wants to expel the difficult feelings and the recipient wants to soothe and settle the baby as soon as possible, so all feel better. When bad feelings are pushed into the mother, then it can appear to the infant that the mother has turned bad. This can frighten a vulnerable infant who's still developing a sense of their self. Their cognitive capacities are still too undeveloped and fragile, and they can easily fragment when frightened, in pain, or fear they won't survive. Now, at night, Sammy demanded his mother's presence as a 3-year-old when he didn't have her back in the hospital, and she felt unable to bear with him, lacking the emotional resources to soothe his fear of dying because of her own fear of death. In therapy, as trust deepened, Sammy felt safe to bring his nightmarish, terrifying inner world. He played out violent fantasies of a nasty biting crocodile who attacked his sister and others. How do these intense fears and anxieties get sorted and held in mind safely? How do child psychotherapists sit with and work with these intense emotions and experiences? They work with the here and now of the therapy session, taking note of the child's playing, relating, moods and mental states, whilst also monitoring their own responses to their experiences of the child in the room. A therapy break represents a relational rupture and may reflect earlier in life ruptures in the primary attachment relationship. Sammy's therapist noticed his anxieties and fears increased whenever there was a break in therapy. Following one such break, Sammy was distraught, building to rage. The break had triggered traces of his early experiences in hospital and being left. The therapist was actively present in the here and now of his rage, what Winnicott calls the white heat of a session, ready to make meaning without being knocked off balance, being dominated by them, or driven into action herself. Bion refers to this capacity in a therapist or a mother as reverie. That is, where a person opens themselves to experiencing the emotional quality present in the relationship. This is where the mother, in ordinary circumstances, takes in the baby's distress and fear of dying and digests it, returning it to the infant in a more bearable form. The therapist was, through her training, able to sit with uncertainty, doubt, and Sammy's unbearable feelings of grief, rage, and distress. Now, returning to Melanie Klein, as the infant matures and has experienced many satisfying relational moments with their important others, this builds a resource the baby can draw on, and the split between good and bad of early experience, early infancy, is modulated. The baby comes to feel that the person whom I hated is also the one I love. This is a crucial developmental step, enabling a shift from the potential for feeling resentful and mistrustful to one of basic trust. With trust, there is an opening to reciprocity, a capacity to make reparation, and for creativity and play. It is based in the capacity to mourn the loss of the fantasy world of omnipotence and controlling mother to one of separateness and reality. Although when under stress, children and adults can revert to early learnt patterns, such as seeing the world in black and white, as were Sammy's nightmare experiences. Now, recently, child psychotherapist Graham Music, one of those that I had on the slide earlier, has written extensively about his approach to working with children and adolescents, incorporating a wide base of knowledge and research to gather into and affirm and underpin the contemporary relevance of child psychotherapy. He and Anne Alvarez before him show the implications for psychotherapy of new research in neurobiology, developmental psychology, and attachment. For those with the most serious disturbances, both recommend play alone, and being with the child is what is needed. In fact, Winnicott stated in 1971 that play is a therapy itself. Peter Blake, the Sydney child psychotherapist, also wrote about play and described it as the dangerous edge of safety in play, where therapeutic shifts occur. Now, that's probably spot on what you were talking about last time, Campbell. For those who cannot play, Winnicott said the aim of therapy was to bring the child to a place where they can begin to play. Play is where a child discovers his self. Graham Music has written a new book called Respark and describes children who can't play. He uses the metaphor of sparking, that is, for types of energy. We need energy for life, and too little or too much is problematic. He has found children often fit into presentations he termed unsparked, desparked, and missparked. Unsparked children and adolescents have never come to life or been sparked before, like the Romanian orphans who were cared for well enough, but were profoundly psychologically and emotionally deprived. The therapist's job is to try to find a little bit of spark and grow it into a potential by being able to tolerate this lack of aliveness and the unbearable states evoked. Knowing empathically, at a deep level, the child's experiences and using that to connect is what is needed. Winnicott would say we have to survive their deadness without becoming dead ourselves. Music is basically writing about defences when he describes desparking and missparking. Desparked children are those who have suffered a trauma, have often given up, and their protective strategy is to shut down, numbing both mind and body. So even the capacity to think is shut down. This response of freeze or going floppy is a highly effective defence against danger and being overwhelmed. And he describes the neurology underlying those responses. We need to be very careful not to push through such a defence too soon, as it can re-traumatise. Recent research into the neurobiology of trauma has shown that engendering safeness gives a signal to the nervous system to relax. The therapeutic focus can take time, as these children are primed to be triggered by their internal working models of unsafe adults. And so the therapist aims to be dependably safe and non-threatening, thus providing a safe container. So the child develops and consolidates an internal working model of safeness. Missparked, for example, like manic states of behaviour. Winnicott saw one form of manic defence, or missparking in music's terms, as a way of avoiding having someone to rely on. These infants and children retreated into their head, developing a hyperactive mind, like intellectualisation. Underneath, there might be terrible grief and pain that has never been faced. Addiction is another form of missparking. He explains this, that when very difficult early experiences are intolerable, addictive behaviours can be a way of holding the self together on the one hand, or maybe function as respite from awful early experience. Addictive behaviours are facilitated by the dopaminergic system, which activates the reward systems, motivation and habit learning. He tells us that this system is being fired up deliberately by those companies such as Google, Apple, Meta, and so on, with their digital media and games. Paediatrician Jennifer Radeski researches screen use in young children and also tells us these companies design it and its products to keep us online. Their profit mode is for this. Child psychotherapists help young people to slow down and take note of and bear their feelings that they have long avoided. In this way, a child can be supported to develop different pathways, motivations, and more ordinary habits for living within a social relational world. So let's look at the research. Now, is there research evidence for child psychotherapy? Resoundingly, yes. Now, I've listed reams, and I could go on several slides of research showing that child psychotherapy is effective. The body of research is being enriched and validated by neuroscience findings, attachment research, developmental studies, and infant studies. The cumulative evidence over the last 2 decades is significant and overwhelmingly supports the efficacy and effectiveness of child psychotherapy for parents and infants, under 5s, children and adolescents in a wide range of presenting problems. Studies listed here are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which means they've reviewed many studies. Most are outcome studies. One such example, Nick Midgley, recent, and his team, the Anna Freud Centre, in 2021 published a systematic review of 82 distinct studies and 100 from 123 papers. 22 studies were RCTs. RCTs are random controlled trials, and they are the gold standard for rigor in research. Midgley found evidence of effectiveness of the psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy in treating the wide range of mental health difficulties in children and adolescents. So who is it effective for? Depression and anxiety, attention, behavioural and impulsivity problems, for example, ADHD, social communication delays and deficits, e.g. ASD, complicated disorders that had previously been thought to be beyond treatment, severely deprived children, emerging personality disorders, and children who have experienced adversity, fostered and adopted children, sexually abused children, and also children under 5 years and their caregivers. Researching child psychotherapy is complex. Long-term psychotherapy for severe and complex mental health disorders is especially difficult to study with the gold standard RCT design. because they require a control group and large numbers of participants. With effectiveness now clear, researchers can turn from outcome research and focus more on process and other creative ways to explore relational qualities in therapy. Just want to tell you about a couple of local studies. Have we got time or? One of these studies, referred to in Midgley's review, was by Professor Bruce Tong and my colleague, Dr. Jill Pullen, who Jill ran the Time for a Future study for 15 years. They produced a naturalistic longitudinal study that examined the effectiveness of individual psychoanalytic psychotherapy in reducing symptoms and improving overall functioning for adolescents with complex, severe mental illness. At 12 months, they found psychotherapy was associated with a greater reduction in depressive, social and attention problems than treatment as usual. Now, Jill went on and did a PhD following up some of those adolescents. It was a qualitative study, and the adolescents had participated in the Time for a Future study. She explored their lived experience of the psychotherapy using semi-structured, in-depth interviews several years following the end of their therapy. She also interviewed the therapists and the CAMS service directors within which the adolescents had received the psychotherapy. In the interviews, she writes, some young people went as far as telling her that their psychotherapy had been fundamental in why they were now still alive. Jill writes, it is critical to know what treatments best help adolescents suffering extreme psychological disturbance who are at risk of suicide and further deterioration. The adolescents in this study had suffered from earlier traumas and losses, and their developmental trajectory had been derailed by mental illness and developmental breakdown. Her key findings were that the therapeutic relationship was central, and that trust, building trust within an ongoing and dependable relationship, was key. The study identified qualities in this special type of relationship. The psychotherapist is trained to listen to conscious and unconscious communications, sat with intense emotions and difficult experiences relating to the adolescents in the here and now, relationship between therapist and adolescent. They were attuned to the micro shifts in the adolescent's mood and mental states without closing off or enacting. More difficult to do than saying it. Relied on their theoretical framework and clinical supervision to keep them anchored. The service systems also provided an important supporting frame for the work. Now, this is a unique and most important study also because its findings not only show effectiveness of psychotherapy in the lived experience of these young people and affirmed by the experience recalled by their psychotherapists, but also it shined a spotlight on other issues, inequity of access to services. Regional and outer metropolitan areas struggled to recruit and retain trained clinicians, let alone specialised ones. It demonstrated that psychoanalytic psychotherapy offers effective treatment, life-changing and life-saving for the most complex and vulnerable adolescents in our society. The new foci based in neuroscience and attachment research provide new tools and concepts for investigating micro-shifts within the therapist-patient relationship and within and across sequences of sessions. These findings are now being applied to study therapeutic processes. Recently, Peter Fonagy's research team identified epistemic trust as a key component in favourable therapy outcomes and are now seeking to identify the specific mechanisms underlying the relational dynamic and then what may enhance it. The microscope is on the micro shifts in therapy and nuances of the patient-therapist relationship. So there is abundant, high-quality, in summary, abundant, high-quality research for the effectiveness of child psychotherapy. Narrow positivistic scientific attitudes to research have given ground and are accepting a wider interpretation of what makes up high-quality research. Qualitative methodologies have been acknowledged for contributing valuable insights in their own right, as well as complementing and enhancing quantitative research findings. And lastly, well, there's Dr. Fulham's. Oh, look, there we go. The last slide. Lastly, research is not always about the effectiveness of child psychoanalytic psychotherapy. My research was on the developing mother and infant relationship when the infant had major surgery for severe congenital heart disease in the first weeks of life. There are a myriad ways a child psychoanalytic psychotherapist's theoretical frame may be applied to research in other fields, health, education, community, and so on. There are unlimited imaginative ways to explore these domains. And now back to Ruth, who's going to, amongst other things, talk about other applications.
Now, I'm going to, in this section, talk about or present some discussion about clinical work and thinking about children, infants, and youth. Infants and children think to a degree and complexity that reflects their developmental stage. They also feel and they work to understand and to make sense of their world of relationships, of themselves in the world, and how to survive and thrive in their environment. And maybe as we sit here, you can recall such moments and experiences in your own lives. When children are distressed, experiencing mental health challenges or behavioural issues, clinical child psychoanalytic psychotherapy provides an entry to understanding and ameliorating a worrying situation that is concerning parents, caregivers, and often the child themselves. A comprehensive assessment and short-term or long-term treatment, if needed, aims to achieve these goals. As well as working with the child, psychotherapists also work directly with the parents, carers, and services to understand their concerns and to assist them to understand and to be tuned into the child, to assist them to understand more deeply their relationship with the child, and to discuss supporting the child as the child moves forward. The psychoanalytic theoretical and clinical framework works within a highly dynamic matrix to understand and assist children and their families to reduce and hopefully overcome the child's distress and to enable the child to continue on a healthy developmental pathway. Hence the description: psychodynamic psychotherapy. It is a multi-layered and complex. It is indeed dynamic. The working relationship with the therapist is central, as Jenny has outlined very clearly today, and is established in a predictable setting that is child-friendly, but designed not to set the agenda or to provide direction, but to provide an environment where the child can actually be themselves, to discover their world of thoughts and feelings, and for the child to be able to think about these and their world and become active in understanding who they are in themselves and in their world. This may unfold through self-directed play with toys, sand, drawing, etc., as well as talking with the therapist. More frequently, especially with young children, a complex communication emerges through a mixture of multiple simultaneous or concurrent use of these modalities. I'd like to give you an example of how the psychoanalytic psychotherapy approach can assist young people clinically. And with respect to the privacy of the children and the families with whom I've worked, I'm not presenting an actual case, but a collation that combines common elements and themes from a number of cases. One of the key concerns in our society today is the increase in the diagnosis of ADHD. The parents of Mary Lou, age 7, contacted me concerned about her disruptive behaviour, erratic moods, and anxiety that escalated towards the end of the day. She had been referred by her GP for a paediatric assessment, and no physical concerns were identified. Following appropriate psychometric testing, an ADHD diagnosis was given, and Mary Lou was prescribed Ritalin. Her parents were concerned about the long-term effects of medication and decided to go down the path of psychodynamic psychotherapy first. I met with Mary Lou's parents to gain a developmental history, to understand the evolution of the current situation, to understand their concerns and hopes, as well as Mary Lou's and the family's strengths, resources, and any vulnerabilities. This meeting also gave them the opportunity to ask questions, to understand the process, and to be in a position to introduce the clinical context to Mary Lou within their style of communication. A core principle of psychoanalytic psychotherapy is to start where the child is at within themselves and where the parents are at with their concerns, their understanding of them, and their approaches to managing the situation, and also the outcomes they're seeking for their child and their family. It transpired that some years previously, when Mary Lou was 4, one night they experienced a particularly violent thunderstorm with wild wind and rain belting on the windows of the side of the house where the bedrooms were. Mary Lou was asleep at the time and woke screaming. She was inconsolable for the rest of the night, needing the comfort of her mother to sleep with her. Next day, to her empathically tuned in parents, she described her experience of the storm as witches and ogres trying to get into my room. Explaining the facts of thunderstorms provided the containment and the assurance that Mary Lou needed. She settled, and they heard no more about it. At the age of 4, witches, ogres, devils, baddies, etc., are active in the imagination of children. We can think of the stories that engage children at this stage, such as the big bad wolf in Red Riding Hood, the 3 little pigs, Billy Goat Scruff, and so on and it goes. Mary Lou's parents recalled that some months later, after this event, she started to become ratty and put it down to Mary Lou starting school with the associated challenges. Very gradually and over time, her behaviour evolved to the point where her parents sought assistance and she received the ADHD diagnosis. So what was the process of therapy? The therapy room was child-friendly with appropriate sized table and chairs, a few familiar everyday toys such as paint easel, sand tray, everyday dolls. It was low-key, not cluttered, and not setting a scene. For her first appointment, Mary Lou chose to come into the room with her mother. She was curious to explore the toy cupboards. She engaged easily with me, and soon she said to her mother, "You can go now, Mum," and she left the room. For the first few sessions, I let Mary Lou set the agenda to assist me to understand her in this moment of time, noting the content, style and patterns of her play, and the nature and the quality of her relationship and interactions with me. Through her play, drawings and conversations with me, it gradually emerged that she was scared of going to bed because storms can happen. And in summary, this scares me and I can't sleep. I try to stay awake. And sometimes I know there are scary things outside my window, because I see them moving the blinds, on the blinds. Mary Lou was in a state of constant anxiety, underpinned by worry about storms happening, with her imagination about this very active. She was constantly tired through disrupted sleep and living with her reality of scary things outside her window at night, which in fact were shadows of a tree moving in the breeze. Mary Lou chose to paint, graphically painting pictures of the scary ogres and witches. She played a lot with the little Grecan dolls in the doll's house. She played little vignettes of witches and ogres terrifying children, especially if they were happily doing other things or if they were asleep. Through giving her the opportunity to communicate in her own style through a self-directed combination of toys, painting and language, all in a multifaceted conversation with me, Mary Lou responded with an emphatic yes when I wondered with her if she ever felt like the dolls, that happened to her, that she felt scared. She had developed a language for her experience through play and conversation that enabled her to think about it, enabled her to develop an understanding of what was happening for her, and she was able to then share it. This opened the opportunity for her to receive the help she needed. I asked her if she'd like to tell her parents about her scared feelings, and she nodded with enthusiasm. Mary Lou and her parents came together for a family session. They were surprised as, like Mary Lou, they had no idea of the issues underlying her anxiety and the presentation of her behaviours indicative of ADHD. We all agreed to take some more time to untangle and settle the concerns and misunderstandings with the goal to relieve Mary Lou's anxiety. Mary Lou and her parents agreed to my suggestion that I talk with her school teachers to clarify the underpinnings of Mary Lou's behaviours and to assist her within the classroom environment and also in her interaction with her peers. 6 months after the initial appointment with me, Mary Lou had a checkup appointment with her paediatrician, who repeated the same ADHD assessment. It showed that she was now without any ADHD features and was well within the normal range. Her paediatrician and I discussed this outcome in the context of the increased diagnosis of ADHD in children, including the importance of understanding the child's world from their perspective and the increased and nuanced insight it gives us to their presenting symptoms and to their general functioning. In the context of psychoanalytic-based clinical intervention, there was also some cognitive clarification which supported Mary Lou to reframe her worries once the underlying issues were understood. As a postscript, in another unrelated context some years later, I met with one of the parents who said Mary Lou had grown into a fine young woman who was doing well in her chosen career, but was still a bit of a busy bee. I brought to this case my training and knowledge of child development underpinned by psychodynamic theory and also as it relates to parenting. Although the result of time constraints tonight, I haven't been able to tease out the finer detail of this case, but it demonstrates starting where the child and her family are at, engaging the child and family together as the treatment entity, assessing developmental, health and life context, looking at the world through the child's eyes and respecting this, following the child, listening deeply, play as a communication, the clinical setting is an element of the treatment, the therapeutic context of safety and trust, the relationship with the therapist who observes and thinks with an open, curious mind, engagement with the child's community, in this case, the child and the paediatrician, the school and the paediatrician. Child psychoanalytic psychotherapy is different from other forms of therapy and mental health theoretical frameworks that focus on symptoms, pathology, family structures, overt behaviours or thinking styles that initiate and maintain symptoms. Child psychoanalytic psychotherapy is directed to understanding the inner world of the child and how it underpins their thoughts, feelings, and how these are expressed in behaviour, their relationships, and in their attitudes, etc. Turning to the community application of child psychoanalytic psychotherapy, the knowledge base and principles of child psychoanalytic practice have, over recent decades, made a rich contribution beyond the formal clinical context in what I describe as applied child psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy informs and is practiced in a wide range of settings. Yes, we've got the right overheader. For example, infant mental health, foster care, child protection, children and young people with disability, refugee families, families experiencing domestic violence, children in hospital, teachers and school communities, child maternal health care services, childcare in kindergartens. In these settings, it also provides opportunities for workers to better understand the organisational contexts and social interactions with the young and their families. Organisations particularly appreciate the opportunity for staff to be able to discuss client or work-based stresses and dynamics in relation to issues they're dealing with, often in highly pressurised circumstances. The power of the psychodynamic approach is that it provides the opportunity to develop an understanding of the issues and processes of interaction between staff, staff and children, staff and management, and the staff policy interface. This comes about with the psychotherapist being alert to conscious and unconscious processes that are active, such as avoidance, denial, transference, and projection. Holding the anxiety that is present, rather than moving precipitously to actions or solutions, enables clarification of issues, enables thinking, which leads staff to understand what is in play and therefore develop a more nuanced, grounded approach to the challenges or problems. I will describe two very brief and different thumbnail sketches of child psychoanalytically informed community applications. They were in response to concerns about children and families impacted by disasters. In December 2004, the Indonesian province of Aceh was devastated by the Indian Ocean tsunami, where 200,000 people died. Many were injured, and all survivors were homeless and without income. More women, mothers, died than men, fathers. A very great number of children were orphaned or lost one parent. Some children that survived had also lost siblings and their extended family of grandparents, etc. Many of you will recall this time. It was devastating. All community facilities, including food supplies and sanitation, medical services and schools, were destroyed or rendered immediately useless. The countryside was inundated for large distances inland, kilometres inland. Roads were washed away, and the sea, a major source of food, was polluted with chemicals and goodness knows what else as a result of the earthquake that preceded the tsunami, causing the ground to sink and the sea to flow in. As a result of decades-long working relationship of the Royal Children's Hospital International with the University of Gadjah Yogyakarta, RCH was invited to provide support to the health recovery systems and the processes, including mental health. On a regular visiting basis over 3 years, I worked with the psychology department of UGM to develop and support their extensive program and to provide training in mental health, in disaster impact, and in personal and community recovery. It was not a training in psychodynamic theory or practice, but psychodynamic theory and practice underpinned everything I did, even though my colleagues were not aware of it. It involved meeting and working with local community and religious leaders and community groups from the devastated area, and also with surviving local and regional services such as health, schools, and members of government and universities. An important part of the work was meeting with the women who were caring for the surviving children, often not their own, and in the face of having lost their own children and other family members. While it was indeed multifaceted, I didn't provide a clinical service. The work was highly valued to the extent that I continue to be invited to contribute to their online summer school. Now I'm going to move to the second example, which was a community application that was very, very different. The DAC Centre here, in this building where we are now, under the leadership of Dr. Eugen Coe, a training for primary school teachers called ELVA was developed. Emotional literacy through visual arts. Some of you in the audience may be aware of ELVA or may be primary school teachers who are ELVA graduates. ELVA aimed to increase the emotional capacity of children to learn through their experience rather than through skills training and behaviour modification, and to develop an emotionally reflective mind. ELVA is a process, not a program. It was seamlessly integrated into the required curriculum goals and outcomes, aiming as a preventive approach to support children to recognise their own inner world and to appreciate that other children have inner worlds of thoughts, feelings, ideas, and wishes too. This supported the building of a basis of self-awareness, self-understanding, and the building of enhanced understanding and empathy and respect for their classmates. ELVA was based on the integration of psychoanalytic concepts, child development, neuroscience, and art as therapy, not art as a technique. It was presented in a way to bring this knowledge alive for the teachers and in a format that could be readily translated and be active in the classroom. It definitely was not art as therapy, but was art as communication to the self and others. It was carefully and thoughtfully designed by experienced teachers, clinicians, and an art therapist. There are 6 domains to ELVA: the student, the activity, their teacher, the student-teacher relationship, the learning environment, being the classroom and school, and the broader school environment. Prior to training and the introduction of ELVA to a school, information meetings were held with staff and parents, along with newsletters to introduce them to ELVA. ELVA offered a whole-of-school training as well as to selected staff, plus ongoing support as teachers applied ELVA in the classroom. Training was conducted by an experienced school teacher and a clinician, myself. Care was taken to ensure that appropriate channels and services were in place should concerns arise about the well-being of any child or teacher. The training included the psychodynamic understanding of boundaries and containment to assist teachers to provide a culture where children felt subjectively safe and secure. The pilot training was evaluated by the University of Melbourne Centre for Program Evaluation. In their report of the implementation phase, teachers reported the following. They had developed greater emotional self-awareness and had a greater understanding of how their thoughts and emotions could impact on their students. Being more reflective and empathic and mindful. That they developed a greater awareness of creating a caring and supportive environment when encouraging children to express their emotions, that the training had changed the way they teach and think about teaching. A 2017 ELVA trainee said, "ELVA training has changed the way I do everything. It's changed the way I work with my students and the way I relate to and understand my co-workers. And it's even improved the way I communicate with my partner." Another 2017 trainee reported, "Students who would never talk and share are coming out of their shell and are a lot more confident." Children reported that ELVA teaches me about myself, and there were lots of other similar comments. The next two slides show the individual representation of the classroom theme, Dreaming Over Time, where the children chose how they would like to represent this. And another theme that they had developed for classrooms were the representation of rainbows of feelings. And with another classroom theme of inside-outside feelings, using boxes, children represented these feelings in their own style, with a range of materials available to them, such as paper, string, and fabric, for example. The children and their families have given permission for these photos to be shown in the public domain. Training findings were replicated when ELVA training was provided to and adapted for teachers from schools impacted by the Black Saturday 2009 bushfires in Victoria. And that's quite a complex diagram, but it's available online. In 2017, ELVA was the Victoria Vic Health Award finalist in the category Building Health Through Art. The training requires resourcing over 18 months to enable teachers to absorb their learnings and apply them while receiving ELVA support through the process. When the DAC Centre became part of the Sane Australia Group in 2012 and focus consolidated around adolescents and adults, funding became an issue, and consequently, ELVA training is no longer available. This leads us to consider how the knowledge and expertise of child psychoanalytic psychotherapy can be made available to contribute to the mental health and the well-being of our children and young people. Moving forward, many of the concepts that underpin psychoanalytic therapy are embedded in the thinking of the everyday conversational discourse in our society. We talk about, "Oh, I wonder what that dream meant," or "That was a slip of the tongue," or "Heavens above, that was a bit unconscious," or we use those in our everyday language. However, to a large extent, psychoanalytic psychotherapy remains outside or is indeed resisted in considerations of the mental health and mental well-being. In the context of increasing prevalence of mental ill health in our young, this presentation tonight is aimed to provide an opportunity to consider current psychoanalytic theory and practice and what it can offer to clinical understanding and to wider community considerations such as policy, service options, and resource allocations to clinical practice and to service delivery. Holding in mind what we've presented this evening, I'd like to focus on summarising some central themes. Infants, children, and youth have a mind which is in a constant state of dynamic, multi-layered activity. Good enough attachment relationships are core, and they need to be experienced by the child in the here and now, as Jenny described, and not at a prescribed or delayed time. Healthy individuation and separation occurs as a developmental process when these needs are met. The adult mind assists the infant, child, and adolescent to think, to understand, and also to regulate their emotions. These learnings or skills gradually become internalised and become the child's own. The external world of the child is important too, and includes relationships beyond the family, plus organisations and services. Being able to reflect on the interaction of oneself and or the service with the child or youth and or their family, as demonstrated by the elder teachers, contributes to the well-being and mental health of the child. Turning our focus to today's world, we can ask from a psychodynamic perspective if the way our lives are lived is working to undermine the mental health and well-being of our infants, children and adolescents. If we answer yes, what can we do about it? Understand the child's world, inner world, especially when they're distressed or experiencing mental health issues before a diagnosis is formulated. Continue to be open to bringing psychoanalytic understanding into everyday life. Bring psychodynamic knowledge to family stress and to organisations and services working with troubled children, and also to communities as they deal with complex issues and situations. Bring the well-being of infants, children and youth to the fore in policy development and management plans, including the psychodynamic lens. An example of where this is needed is the current economic push to bring women, most often the initial and ongoing primary caregiver, into the workforce by expanding the availability of childcare. While acknowledging the importance and benefits of childcare in the lives of many children and families, childcare as it stands in many situations today is not necessarily appropriate for all infants and children or in all children's best interests. The new Oxford American Dictionary defines an important difference between child care and child nurturing. The child psychoanalytic position is that all situations, relationships, and experiences should be nurturing of the infant and child, as we've discussed this evening, with care as an important part of this. Psychoanalytic theory would argue that for some infants and children experiencing multiple caregivers with subtle but different communication styles, expectations, and relationship patterns can be confusing to infants and children and can work against them feeling safe and secure in a predictable world of trusted relationships and expectations. This has the potential to lead to an unstable inner world, resulting in susceptibility to or actual anxiety or other signs of mental stress. In so many instances across the board in society, assistance is needed to develop an appreciation of the importance of primary carers being available, tuned in, and responsive to children when the child needs it. Similarly, the impact of the gig economy, of financial stress and social disruption on the security, safety, and stability of parents undermines their capacity to provide this for their children. The ever-pervasive digital world. The evidence is clear and abundant that, as currently engaged in by so many infants, children, and adolescents, many aspects of the digital world are damaging our young. When infants, children, and adolescents experience mental health challenges, services and highly trained, highly competent, well-mentored and supervised clinicians are needed. And they need to be enabled to function to the same standards required for physical health. The political emphasis on funding for wellness programs and short-term mental health treatment is important. Currently, the health needs of serious mental illness in children and youth who require highly skilled and long-term treatment and care are to the sideline. This situation is so different from the clinical research and financial resources available for physical health. Aligning mental and physical health policy and practice and funding would have significant positive outcomes for infant, child and youth mental health. MIFIC and the CPPAA are working together to engage with the mental health reform process currently underway to emphasise this, but wider community support is needed as well. At this point, I would like to briefly draw attention to the specialist level of child psychoanalytically trained clinicians here in Victoria and the need to, once again, recognise the profession in its own right. While government mental health policy and management recognise the competence and contribution to the public health system of child psychoanalytically trained clinicians, it's somewhat hidden profession. Generally, child psychotherapists are employed according to their original profession, such as psychologist, occupational therapist, social worker, for example. This makes it difficult for services to identify, engage, and benefit from their additional specialist skills. In closing, we would like to share with you a quotation from an article in the Sunday Age in December last year, when Trent Dalton, author of Boy Swallows Universe and father of 2 teenage girls, was interviewed about his forthcoming book, Lola in the Mirror. He said, "The thing I have learned about teenage girls is to approach them like anyone you care about, from the inside out. Find out what is in their heart, their brain, what they're scared of and care about. See what they see. When you've done that, open your ears." Jenny and I hope that our time together this evening has given you some ideas for your way forward with the young people in your orbit and the services that engage with them. So thank you.
Thank you, Ruth and Jenny, for a very challenging series of thoughts. I think the audience will need a few minutes to think of the things that they would like to pursue with you in questioning. So before we let the audience ask their questions, I'd like to call on last year's orator, Professor Campbell-Paul, to respond to your presentation, which perhaps will give people a chance to organise their thoughts and questions. And we'll have a roving microphone to help you put those questions afterwards. Associate Professor Campbell-Paul, our Winston Rickards orator of last year, is a consultant infant, child, adolescent and family psychiatrist at the Royal Children's Hospital and Royal Women's Hospitals, Melbourne, a principal fellow in psychiatry at the University of Melbourne, and a psychoanalytic psychotherapist himself, specialising with infants, children and families. Campbell is a pioneering innovator and leader in the work with First Nations people in both clinical and research areas, with young people in the transgender domain, in group psychotherapy, and in the training and practice of infant mental health in this country. His national work was honoured in 2023 by the Royal College of Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists by the award of their annual college citation. And furthermore, Campbell is currently president of the World Association in Infant Mental Health. Now, Campbell, if you'd like to give your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a great honour to be able to talk with you this evening. I'm going to be hopefully brief and allow opportunity for some really lively discussion. Acknowledge the Rickards family, who I've known for many, many years, since 1980, I guess. Welcome with us, and welcome Anne to join us today, and Tom and Katrina. I'd like to acknowledge very briefly the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who've been traditional owners and carers of this land for some 60,000 years of continuous culture. Lands here that were never ceded. I acknowledge the original elders and elders past, present and emerging of the First Nations people, particularly the people with whom I've had the really great privilege of working with and learning so much from over the course of many years about the importance of culture and community in our work. I'd like to present apologies from the Acting Director of the Mental Health Service at the Children's Hospital, who are one of the key components of the support for this really important annual Oration. Dr. Prakash, the director who's acting at the moment, is currently in India and sends his best wishes. But especially I'd like to thank Ruth and Jenny for a really powerful presentation in what is a really extremely important subject. You've taken us on a wonderful journey tracing the evolution of psychoanalytic psychotherapies all the way from the revolutionary discoveries and elucidation of the unconscious mental processes as developed by Sigmund Freud through conservative Vienna, right through to the crucial developments, scientific evolution of evidence-informed psychodynamic psychotherapies for infants, families, now in our current century. The key concept I'd like to emphasise that you've brought to us as well is that of what's there at the birth of the human infant is the capacity for intersubjectivity, being able to recognise the subjectivity of the other. This is a process that develops throughout the life process, becoming more and more sophisticated, more and more intense, but they're right from the beginning. We need to acknowledge the importance of exploring subjectivity of the young people whom we're seeing. And I think you brought that phenomenon and the importance of it to us through your presentations. Your presentations have been very inspiring for me, taking me back down professional developmental pathways quite a long way back and looking at things anew. I've got very clear memories of my time as a medical student. So this was 1974, I think, when we did a weekly half-day substantive placement in child psychiatry during our 10-week undergraduate general psychiatry training. Things are not quite the same now, but at that time it was very powerful. Our small medical student group trekked over to the old Children's Hospital from this campus through the Royal Melbourne over to the Children's. And we went up to the 5th floor to sit behind a one-way mirror to observe Dr. Winston Rickards perform what seemed like magic as he worked with stressed and troubled young children and their parents. We sat in the dark, but we were illuminated by what we heard and what we saw. We were plugged into the sound with very large headphones, watching while Winston, through play, his soft musical voice, used toys and enabled troubled young children to share with him, often with their parents present and involved, their unconscious anxieties, their inner thoughts, their subjectivity. I was also privileged to be taught by Margaret Erickson, Eileen Anderson, the passionate and erudite Anne Morgan, and of course Ruth Wraith and Jenny Ray. There were also some 7 psychoanalysts on our staff and many other psychoanalytically trained people, including psychoanalytically trained psychologists, Susie Dean, Pat Leeper, and many others. As a young child psychiatrist in training, psychoanalytic psychotherapy was rich and extensive. Even the surgeons were able to assimilate. And Frank Bishop was one of our key trainers. Frank was a surgeon before he saw the trauma that through his surgical work that young children who might be abused and neglected experienced, and he switched to become one of our key trainers. This was all blended together in our various therapies, and it was a holding environment indeed. We had family therapy with psychoanalyst George Christie, with Andrew Firestone, with Peter Burleson, a strong family therapist, and later the inimitable creative Sarah Jones and many others. In this rich environment, a very, very cross-disciplinary infant mental health team was able to grow and thrive, supported by Winston and our subsequent directors and staff. Through all this was the important stream of psychodynamic psychotherapy, trying to understand what unconscious processes might be driving the infants, children and adolescents we were seeing, trying to understand, trying to explore with children and their parents ways of what might have been experienced as really very extensive, painful labyrinths of trauma and distress. Ruth, Wraith and Rob Gordon especially helped us to see the experience of trauma through the eyes, the ears, the noses, the touch of even the youngest children, how they experienced pain and trauma, challenging the cohesion of their inner world, their sense of safety and containment. Through psychoanalytically informed play therapy, the child can share their experience and trauma with others, make some sense of it in their own mind and work through much of the adverse impact of stressful and terrifying events. As Ruth mentioned, she responded strongly and creatively to the impact of the terrifying bushfires of '83. Actually, I don't know that you did mention that, did you? Did? Okay. Anyway, I'm mentioning it. I can, again, picture as I stand here, being a few hundred metres down the road and watching the clouds of black smoke and dust and wind coming from the west. The bushfires of '83, Ruth and Rob led amazing interventions in community. But also the experience of 4 children who were trapped in a Melbourne kindergarten in 1990, besieged by an angry man at the Manresa kindergarten. Ruth worked with the people who were on the ground, who'd helped the children escape, and then with the children and parents themselves, thoughtfully over time in the process of assimilating a terrifying trauma. Psychodynamic psychotherapy is the foundational tool that's used by Ruth and Rob and Jenny in understanding children's experience, helping others in the community work in that way as well, work with schools and many other community agencies, as Ruth was saying, even overseas. Of course, what constitutes a trauma or traumatic stress can be different for different children in different circumstances, experienced differently depending on what's their family situation and other phenomena. We know that many children who have major traumatic experiences, of those, maybe a quarter will go on to have persisting and perturbing evident post-traumatic stress symptoms or disorders. But that's in the context of relatively stable society and family. I think it's really important for us to think about what the experience might be for young children in the midst of totally terrifying chaos and pandemonium, the experience of war. And what their experience is going to be is exceedingly higher rates of ongoing disruption to their emotional, social, cognitive, developmental trajectories. The fear, the terror is an ongoing experience for those children that is repeated, I think often one generation to the next. And we see this impact of war and conflict and displacement in children from war zones throughout the world, in Syria, Afghanistan, of course, Palestine and Israel itself, in Africa, Myanmar, far too many places. And I think all of the work that Jenny and Ruth have talked about here give us tools to support our colleagues in other countries and refugees who are here to work through some of these traumas as well. Jenny mentioned very briefly at the end an amazing project she undertook with cardiologists and colleagues, looking at the experience of parents and in particular infants using the ADBB tool from our colleague Antoine Guidonnet in Paris, where children are hospitalised, infants are hospitalised for treatment of major congenital cardiac anomalies. And we're working with many of those families day by day at the moment. And as you heard, Jenny has been able to adapt and turn her skills to become a powerful and preeminent educator and trainer for those who are wishing to learn the professionalism and the magic of psychodynamic psychotherapies. But I'm also maybe indicating that there have been massive developments in the range and extent of psychotherapies for children and families over these many years. Jenny mentioned the meta-analytic studies, infant and child adolescent psychotherapeutic interventions, the work of Nick Midgley and Michelle Sleed and many others. The Anna Freud Centre in London, which was very close to the heart of Winston, as was the Tavistock, but the Anna Freud has undergone considerable change over the last 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years. People might recognise different strengths and different directions, but certainly one of the key things happening at Anna Freud is the focus on evaluation of clinical services broadly, but including psychodynamic interventions. We have to be careful about how we go about evaluating programs, because sometimes our tools, research tools, don't always meet the needs of the program being examined, and a number of programs that intuitively and from clinical experience and from some of the data, but not all, have not been, I think, adequately represented in some of the research findings. So different tools, different things that we're looking at. We have a group of parents who've been traumatised. They enter a 12-month program. At the end of the program, the parents seem worse off. But with the tools that we've used, what we've done, I think, is help the parents gain an insight into who they are, what the traumas they've experienced, and they feel insightfully distressed by that, if you like. So there's a paradox of the parent and the relationship has improved, but the tools we've used may not have demonstrated that, may have demonstrated what is, I think, wrongly the obverse. So it's clear that we need to be careful with research, but we must use research, and we must use meta-analyses as well, very judiciously. Winnicott, and I guess Winston too, but when he was working in the 1950s as a clinician at Paddington Children's in London and in private practice, he didn't have the luxury of any dedicated research team or randomised controlled trials. But it was his powerful use of a range of psychoanalytic concepts put together in his own brilliant creative flair in the service of understanding the inner world of the child, their capacity to play, their capacity for speech, and engagement with troubled children and families that led him to tell us a lot about what we now understand about the inner world of the stressed and troubled child. He was able to translate the concepts into relationship-based play, and relationships, of course, are at the foundation of effective psychoanalytic therapy for children and adolescents. In April next month, the 23rd of April, just 4 weeks away, is the 3rd International Acknowledgement of the World Infant, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Day. a group of us, led by the president of YACAPAP, was going through the foci of the World Mental Health Day over the last 40 years. I think it's been going for a long time. And child and adolescent psychiatry got a Guernsey maybe a couple of times. So the group of us from the YACAPAP, the International Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Allied Professions, the World Association for Infant Mental Health, the World Psychiatric Association, Child and Adolescent Division, and the International Society of Adolescent Psychologists and Psychiatrists got together and said, well, we should have an international day representing the importance of child and adolescent, infant, child and adolescent mental health. So that's coming up this year. The focus, the theme is, in their own words, bridges to understanding mental health. And in their own words is a representation of the importance of working with people with lived experience, with parents, with patients, people with lived experience themselves. And for us, there's the extra, as an infant psychiatrist, the extra challenge of making sure we give voice to the very young. How do we hear the voice of the experience of very young children? So that's coming up, and there are a number of events that are part of that. It may seem that in the earlier iterations of psychodynamic psychotherapy with infants, young children and parents, the child went with the psychotherapist and the parents went with the social worker or the psychiatrist. That was a model. But I don't think that model was as rigid as some people might have represented, and many variations were present. And that's an issue that's been recently addressed by a group from Bouverie and an international group of many clinicians from psychotherapy and from family therapy. Jen McIntosh and Jess Opie have put together a number of papers with colleagues from around the world and from here, exploring how psychoanalytic psychotherapies and family therapies may be joined together, and recognition more formally about the importance of this creative collaboration. It sounds like it's new, but it's not. As an infant psychiatrist, it's impossible to do other than direct work with the infant and family work. I'm very indebted to Winston and to Bill Blomfield, George Christie and many others who are pioneering in family therapy. As we know, family therapy arose out of psychoanalytic thinking. So there are many things that we need to draw together, I think, when we're working with infants, young children and their parents. And we also need to give voice to the consumer, and it's a really important role that MIFIC is playing to bring families empowered into co-designing. My daughter, for example, is working in Innsbruck in the Tyrol region in Austria, and has, with a research team, developed a community-based program for parents, or for the children of parents with major mental illness, and now co-designing with consumers on the ground as well as professionals a new program in that region for families where there's perinatal mental health difficulties. So research needs to be ongoing, but it needs to be practical and not using methodologies that might undermine the whole purpose of the activity. Jill Pullen and colleagues with Bruce Tong and others, as Jenny mentioned, have done some amazing research looking at the role of psychoanalytic psychotherapy in changing lives. again, many other systematic and well-researched psychoanalytic psychotherapies have been studied, and Nick Midgley, Simon Cregan, Margaret Rustin and others from the TAVI have developed a treatment manual for short-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy for adolescents with depression. Strong evidence of positive outcome. So research can be really helpful and translatable into actual on-the-ground work. So Ruth and Jenny, two of the pioneers in the development of psychoanalytic psychotherapy for children and adolescents here in Victoria, have given us a wealth of information tonight. So Ruth and Jenny, thank you very much. We owe you a huge debt. And I look forward to some more discussion from you in the audience as well. Again, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you, Campbell, for that interesting commentary, which has answered quite a few of the questions that we might have had. We're fast running out of time, so with our roving microphone, yes, Miriam's there, and and Serena as well. So if any of the audience have questions, we'll invite you to speak into the microphone. If anybody on Zoom is wishing to ask questions, they can type it into their chat box, and they'll be reported by Cecilia. So have we any questions? Yes, Joe.
Thank you very much. Very panoramic, really. You're setting a question about what the future might look like, and how excuse me, and how we might do something in a little time that will actually bring into the public forum and into public service something that has been almost designed out, or it's evolved out, or it's somehow we've all got old and we didn't reproduce. I'd like to say that there is some good news and some bad news. The good news is that every 20 years from 1960 onwards, CBT has gone through a new phase. It started with Beck and Ellis, straight CBT, if you like. 1980, Ellis becomes REBT, puts a B in there, but also Meichenbaum, Marnie and Lazarus comes up with new versions of CBT. In the mid-90s, there was a great triumphalism with RCTs and EVTs, but only 3 years later, at the turn of the new millennium, we have new so-called behaviour therapies, schema therapy, dialectical behaviour therapy, and what's it called? Acceptance and commitment therapy. And they're all trying to solve the problem of how you get on with the client a bit better when you're trying to tell them that they're thinking wrong. And that's been a problem. Well, guess what? Another 20 years on, there's been another version. And this is called, these are the ACT people again, called process-oriented cognitive behaviour therapy. Do you know what process looks at? The relationship between people. Fancy that. 120 years on from Freud, we're learning that the relationship matters. And in Brisbane, we have this group named Menzies, and they're studying a core underlying anxiety called death anxiety. So 20 years on, we'll probably have something about sex, but it might take a full 20 years to get there, which is a bit disappointing, really, because we really want to get on with this job of bringing this stuff back. And I think one of the real problems, that history is true history, and I've written it up in a recent paper, but the problem is that the people making the decisions think like adults. And what you've really said today is that if we're going to make change in our society, we have to allow the child's mind to tell us how to be. Thank you.
I don't know if Ruth or Jenny wish to add to that, or we'll take that as a comment.
Yes, it does, but it's such a dilemma, isn't it? How do you solve that? It's a universal dilemma that the child's interests are not heard in the courtroom, in society, the therapy rooms, and in the sort of policy making and politics. It's the adult voice, the parent voice.
That's our role, to bring it to the notice. Thank you. Any other question? There's a question there?
I was wondering about group psychotherapy. Does the group psychotherapy fall into child psychotherapy realm in some way? I think there was kind of touching upon, but I didn't quite clearly hear whether that was something also useful. Adolescents in particular, but even younger ones.
All I can say again, Megan, is that Rob Gordon ran children's groups for a very long time at the Children's Hospital. And yes, groups are run for children. They're perhaps, yeah, they're not as sort of showcased, I suppose, as individual therapy, but, you know, they're certainly there and psychoanalytically informed.
We've used, like you did with Rob, but infant parent psychotherapy groups. Francis Saylor and I and others have been doing that for a long time. Not presently, but yeah, so there's quite a strong group psychoanalytic influence in the field as well. You're right. Good question.
Any other questions from the audience? Or any on Zoom, Cecilia? Not yet. Okay. Yes, I was employed at the Observatory Clinic in 1976, and that clinic ran children's groups with puppet making and projecting the child's own thoughts and feelings onto the puppets, and then being able to discuss those things. It was a long time ago. Needs to be perpetuated. Well, I think we're actually pretty much running out of time. We're room for
Just to
one
say,
last comment.
one
from
more
Joe.
thing about group psychotherapy is that a group psychotherapist with adults is actually working with child process. They're not working with adult process. They're not talking about adult things. They're getting in touch with the internal worlds that were developed as children.
True. Well, one last comment. Serena, over to this question over there. All right.
This is just a comment actually in relation to where to from now. And it is related that there is a combination of Child Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Association and MIFIC, people representatives, who are who have gotten together and hoping, and anyone can join this group, to work together with, from the ground level, with people who are working in this field, but also dealing with mental health reform with government and so on, other bodies. So that's, you know, to bring to notice and to help people working in the field in terms of understanding these processes that Jenny and Ruth have so beautifully brought to us tonight. But there is something that's, at least we're attempting.
Thank you. Well, we call on our president, Joe, to make some closing remarks and some other information about things that we're doing, after which we hope to get the Rickards family and orators and sponsors to have some photographs taken before retreating out to the lobby for person-to-person discussions. Joe.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I'm sorry that I'm feeling a bit poorly and rather tired. I'm spending a lot of hours asleep each day. But I couldn't not come. And I really appreciate you all being here. I want to encourage you all to take the opportunity to join. $50, it's not a great amount, but it keeps us going. We are really looking forward to changing our structure at some stage. We don't know when, but depending on how we go about this, it could be sooner than as soon as the annual general meeting in August, which I hope you will all feel like you could come along and share with us. It's a very important change that's being considered because it moves us into our formulation as a not-for-profit organisation, which means that we can then seek funding from charities that provide not-for-profit funding, and therefore we can hold more events like this. In the past year, we have been a bit focused on that, but there's so much more work that's been done in the sphere of advocacy with other organisations. As part of this building a new structure is also a new set of relationships. We're trying to establish relationships with like-minded organisations who share some of the information. And Alan produces every month a bulletin which is called the Mental Health Campaigners Advocates Bulletin, and it goes out to various people with whom we are linked. Each person on the committee has a particular set of organisations that they work with to try and bring forward these issues. So the most recent Campaigners Bulletin was on the age of criminal responsibility, by the way, which was rather interesting, given what's happening in the broader world where 10-year-old children are still considered to be adults for some reasons, which are beyond really contemplation. And we want to be able to expand this advocacy through links with other people. We want to involve as many people as we can, and we want to be transparent about these changes so that you can endorse these as we move forward over the next year or 2 years, whatever that is. One other thing that's been really important is that we've had 3 or 4 new people join our executive committee, which is very encouraging. We're very pleased about that. We're still beating them into shape, but they'll get there very quickly because we're probably not going to last all that much longer. So I'd now like to address comments to Jenny and Ruth. Thank you very much. This has been a more enlightening thing than I thought it might have been. Not because I don't think it's an inherently very important and useful thing for us to do. It's just that I'm very pessimistic about mental health services as they exist, and your hopefulness and your courage are not easily matched by my enthusiasm for such organisations. I'd like for you to accept a little gift, and here's a quiz for everybody in the audience. Anybody who thinks they know the answer, there's some people who already know the answer because I read it out before. You're not allowed to answer. You were colleagues of Winston and began work at the Children's Hospital. In the beginning of MIFIC 2, he was our first president. Just a fortnight ago, there was a famous person's birth date. Hint, he died in 1955 and had become well known as a philosopher, and though his original discipline was mathematics, in which he struggled as a child. I provide a beautiful quote. You've got to try and think who this is. And the birth date was the 14th of March. I was hoping that it would actually be that's when we're going to present today. This is the quote. "The pursuit of truth and beauty is a sphere of activity in which we are permitted to remain children all our lives." I repeat, it's quite beautiful. "The pursuit of truth and beauty is a sphere of activity in which we are permitted to remain children all our lives." And this is what this is about, remaining children and being with children, for children, of children. It's beautiful. Now, who knows who this is? Any guesses? Who? Einstein. Albert Einstein. Thank you. So, did you know that?
Yeah,
There were some hints. Yes. And 1955 was the year that the child psychiatry really got a boost in Victoria. It was also the year I was born. 1994 is another significant year because we have three people. There were three people who were the first graduates of the Masters of Child Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy at Monash. Two of them are here tonight. One of them is at home. Lynch, Ray and Wraith, Ruth, Wraith, went across the stage and they were the first graduates. Now, 30 years later, we're fighting to keep this program. Help us fight that fight.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes the evening's presentations. If the Rickards family, orators and others could gather for their photo, we'd be most grateful. And the conversation out in the foyer will follow. Thank you.